Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rachel Stern, and I'm the director and CEO of the Fritz Ascher Society for Persecuted, Ostracized, and Banned Art based in New York. We research, discuss, publish, and exhibit artists whose life and work were affected by the German Nazi regime between 1933 and 1945. Welcome to our Zoom conference, Artists Migrating to the United States in and Beyond the Nazi Period. We are currently in the midst of a refugee crisis with an official count of 82.4 million forcibly displaced persons worldwide. Within the Western world, the second most significant era occurred just prior to the mid-20th century, with the rise of Nazism and other fascist movements across most of Europe. For the next 1.5 hours, our interdisciplinary panel of experts will address the specifics of American immigration policies during that first half of the 20th century and how they particularly affected those seeking refuge from the ravages of the Nazi Holocaust across Europe, the consequences of forced migration in the work of the 7 artists whose work is the focus of our Identity, Art, and Migration project, the continuation and reshaping of issues affecting immigrant artists and their art in the recent history of the United States and the current reality of Europe. Please share your thoughts, experiences, and questions here in the chat function or with the hashtag Identity Art Migration on Twitter. It is my pleasure to welcome today's distinguished panelists, Soltes, Rebecca Erbelding, and Katya Grokhovsky. Each panelist will give a short presentation, which will be followed by a moderated conversation and a Q&A. I'm pleased to first introduce Soltes, who is the co-editor of our current online project, Identity, Art, and Migration. Soltes teaches at Georgetown University across the disciplines of theology, art history, philosophy, and politics. He's the former director and curator of the Nebojtkluznik National Jewish Museum, where he curated some 80 exhibitions. He's the author of several hundred articles and catalog essays, and the author of or editor of 25 books, including The Ashen Rainbow, The Holocaust and the Arts, Symbols of Faith, How Jewish, Christian, and Muslim Art Draw from the Same Source, and Tradition and Transformation, a comprehensive exploration of 3 millennia of Jewish art and architecture, of which a newly revised edition will be published early next year, richly illustrated in color. Welcome, Ori.
Thank you. It is a pleasure to be here. And I think I'm going to go directly to share my screen and bring up this image and begin by saying that I'm going to talk quickly about 8 different artists that cover almost a century. And aside from the fact that the first and last are well outside the time frame related to the Holocaust, aside from that, no 2 of them have the same story in any case. The only thing they all share in common is that in one way, shape, or form, they were immigrants to this country and had to find their way as people and as artists. The first, Ben Shan, who was born in Lithuania in 1898 and came to the United States in 1906. So in other words, at the age of 8, under pressure from the Tsarist regime, came to the United States at a time when immigration was relatively easier than it would become after 1924. And his family was part of this massive migration. And it was here in the States, in New York, that he became an artist, and very quickly was drawn by the 20s to the importance for art as a social and political instrument of commentary on the world around him. So, for example, you see here one of his works called WPA Sunday. It was done in 1939. So at the tail end, but still present Depression, leading directly into the period of war. A few years before that, he had done a series of 23 gouaches about the Sacco Fancetti debacle that was so troubling for the United States sense of itself. And this, of course, is a reflection on the land of wonder is not always wonderful, but his interest in things of course, transcended just the borders of the United States. So his 1942 Prisoners of War gouache is almost certainly, of course, depicting France. We can just infer that from the bit of French we see on the wall here. But the fact of the matter is, these could be any kinds of prisoners behind barbed wire. We recognize it's World War II because we see the swastika on the arms of the soldiers who are obviously guarding these prisoners. So Shan found his way. Of course, he came here very early. He became an artist in this country. He was technically an immigrant, but he grew up here and grew up as an artist here. Around the same time that he is developing as an artist, back in Germany, Annie Albers, born in 1899, was becoming an artist of a very different sort. In 1922, she got to the Bauhaus, which was at the time in Weimar, and that's where she would meet her husband. He was an instructor there. She was a student. She eventuated as an instructor. He is a master instructor. And to cut to the chase, by 1933, the Bauhaus had moved into 3 different locations and then been shut down. And the Albers came to the United States. And the interesting thing is Joseph was invited because he was already widely recognized. She, of course, was not yet, to teach at Black Mountain College in North Carolina, which was as close to a Bauhaus kind of institution as the United States provided. But she would ruefully later on comment, well, I kind of came as a housewife. But the fact of the matter is, she came out of an upper middle class background where English was part of her education. He didn't, and he couldn't speak English. So when they came here, she was the one actually who was interviewed by the reporters. She was the one who really communicated their vision to the world initially in verbal terms because he could not. Now, this wall hanging from 1926, still at the Bauhaus time, is reflective of innovations she was already making in the matter of textile art, using different kinds of material like aluminum foil and cellophane that were conscious not only of aesthetic issues, but of practical issues. Can I dim the sound if I hang these things on the wall because of the materials I use? And by the time she and Joseph left Black Mountain in 1949, 1950, came to New York and moved then to Connecticut, where he ultimately was teaching at Yale University, she was already well recognized in her own right as an artist. And the symptom and symbol of that to me is this one image of the exhibition of her work, a one-woman exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. That's big stuff. MoMA, both because it's an individual female artist who came as an immigrant, but clearly immediately found her way, and because she elevated the notion of textile craft to textile art. In 1984, she would write, "To comprehend art is to confide rather in a constant." Art was the constant in her life. And it's very clear that the transition from Germany to America, to North Carolina, to Connecticut, she was so focused on her art, it seems only to have given here and there new inputs rather than having transformed her. And she was one of the fortunate ones who came at an invitation that didn't make things difficult. Very different is Ava Hessa. And by the way, Albers died in 1994, so she was 95. Ava Hessa was born in 1936 in Hamburg. And she, at the age perhaps of 2.5, was sent in December 1938 on one of the Kindertransport to the Netherlands. So she and her older sister, Helen, are cut off from their parents for about 6 months. That has to have been traumatic for a 2 or 3-year-old. Anyway, the parents catch up with them. They go to England briefly, and then they end up coming to New York City by 1939. So all this in the context of the war. So she grows up, even more so, one might say, than Ben Shan, in America as an American, but they're on the Upper West Side in a community that is dominated by refugees from Germany, within which there is a dominant group of Jewish refugees from Germany. So she grows up bilingual, bicultural, and a very unique kind of person with respect to her identity. In September of 1944, her parents separate. The next year, her mother her father remarries. The year after that, her mother commits suicide. So she sustains, she's 10 years old at the time, a series of early losses. And she ends up marrying Tom Boyle in 1961. A few years later, they get a grant to go to Germany, where they're working in an abandoned textile factory. And by 1966, not only are they back, but they're divorced. Lost, lost, lost. On the other hand, 17 magazine is already featuring her when she's barely out of her teens as someone to watch. She goes ultimately to Yale, where, by the way, she studied with Joseph Albers. And she always had an interest in the kind of abstract painting that had come to dominate by the late 40s and early 50s, the American scene. This is a late work from 1969. It's called Untitled for Gioia, and it reflects the time in the last year of her life that she spent with Gioia Timpanelli in the summer at a cabin in the Adirondacks. And this is the cabin, as it were, with its 4 rooms, with its muddy path along the side, filled with the color that suggests her ongoing interest in painting. And yet, this is not what she's known for. She's known for work like this. When she was in Germany, in this industrial context, one of the things she began to do was 3-dimensional work, and not in a conventional, as you can see, way, but by using, well, rather industrial sorts of material. So this work that she did in 66 called Hang Up, the same year when she ended up in a very important exhibition curated by Lucie Lepard called Eccentric Abstraction. Hang Up, it's a pun. It's what you do with the painting, you hang it on the wall. It's also what, when you have psychological problems, you're said to have hang-ups. And it's actually a stretcher, which has been wrapped around with hospital gauze and been painted subtly in shades of gray. You can't quite see it on the image, I think. She was helped to do that, by the way, by Tom Doyle and her friend Saul Lewitt. But coming out of it is this odd chord that is discordant, because we've got hanging on the wall. Isn't that a painting? But no, it's 3-dimensional. It must be a sculpture. It's a little bit like the constructivists in pre-Soviet Russia, except it's got a softness to it, particularly in that chaotic piece that's hanging out of and offering such a contrast to the frame that, by the way, frames nothing but the wall behind it. So Ava found her way as an artist, but the turning point, oddly, was when she went back to the Germany that had spat her family and herself out and was very unhappy there. Her marriage was falling apart. The conditions were rather uncomfortable, and it transformed her art into that for which she eventually became known. She perished of a brain cancer at the age of 34. That painting I showed you was done during that halcyon summer of the last year of her life, when it appeared that she was in remission, and alas, indeed, she was not. Lily Reine also came at a relatively younger age to the United States during this period. She was born in 1921, and in 1938 or 9, she was sent on a kinder transport, just making it as young enough, to London, where she hoped to be with the family of a friend. Well, she was, but the mother of the friend expected her to be the house cleaner and the cook and all the things she was not used to being. It was not a very happy situation. And she waited for her parents. Eventually, they hooked up together, and they had gotten to America separately. She got to New York. So there they were as a family on the Upper East Side in New York City. And her mother came across an advertisement they were looking for people to help out with comic books at Fiction House. This was a men's business, but most of the men were off fighting the war. So now they were looking for women to replace them, and Lily became one of them, and she became par excellence the best among them. By 1942-3, she had her own series, Jane Martin, who was a pilot, another woman in a field governed by men, and many other series, but I think the most famous, and at least my favorite, is Señorita Rio. You see one of her covers here, who is this rather wild and dashing female James Bond down in South America, who could dress the way Lily never would dress, with a décolletage like you see, while meanwhile on the roof of a building wearing her high heels, calmly sword fighting and defeating this guy. And she's down there as a kind of spy to find bad guys they were either Nazis or surrogate Nazis. And Lily's view was, every time I was doing these scenes, I felt like I was fighting the Nazis. So she found her way in a rather remarkable manner. And of course, she flourishes today at the age of 100. By contrast, in style and background, Arthur Schick, born in Poland, in Łódź in 1894, making his way to London and to Paris, already gaining a name and a reputation for his extraordinary and extraordinarily detailed drawings while he was still in Europe before war broke out, eventually had to come, but he couldn't come directly here. He went to Canada. And then it was much easier eventually to come from Canada to the United States. But he was rather rapidly embraced by the arts community and by the American community because of the way his skills redirected themselves, as you can see here, to what Americans were concerned about. This is Hitler's world, and you can see him and his buddies trying to spin that globe and looking where they're going to plant their flags next. Or this extraordinary image, I hope you can see it, it's Satan leading the band, excuse me. Both of these done about 1942, and you can see Hirohito, and you can see Hitler is down here, this little schlump, and you know, there's Goebbels and so on and so forth, and of course there is the skull of death. Schick was called by Eleanor Roosevelt, you know, a soldier with the pen, more powerful than any we've got. And GIs apparently were so crazy about his work that there were more Schick pinups than there were girly pinups in the GI tents through the war. And he continued afterwards, although he died relatively young in 1951. So very different is the work of Friedel Taubes, born in Berlin in 1915, and who was the youngest in a fairly large family. His mother was Catholic. His father was Jewish. They were raised nominally as Jews. His brothers were bar mitzvah. He was not. And his identity would throughout his life be clearly conflicted between what he was. Toward the end of his life, he apparently was repeatedly looking at a book of Holocaust images. So that's something that was very much in his mind. He managed to get here by fleeing to New York in 1939. And he, coming of age and developing as an artist, he was self-trained, untrained. He had done work as, you know, a painter of walls, not as a painter of paintings. By 1951, he was part of the 9th Street show. And he began in the 60s and 70s and 80s to teach at a number of august institutions. He had more than 60 exhibitions. He was represented at various times by Leo Castelli Gallery, by Andre Emmerich Gallery, by Tibor Nagy Gallery, by Anna Szapolska Gallery. I mean, he had good galleries representing him. And he did this work that when he achieved his canonic style, which is what you see before you here, he called post-painterly abstraction, but it's kind of a midway point between the actionists like Pollock and de Kooning and the chromaticists like Rothko and Newman. You see very much the brushwork apparent, and yet it's these large color swaths. I look at this and I see it almost as if it's a gigantic kind of palette. And I think of Joseph Albers and Hans Hofmann, two emigres like himself, who were all about color theory. He's not about color theory in the formal sense, but informally, his paintings seem to suggest that again and again and again. This is another one from a bit later called Procession. And it's about 10 feet high by almost 25 feet wide. So we're talking about huge paintings. Abstract expressionism was heroically large Americanism. He took that to the nth degree. He dwarfs all the other abstractionists with respect simply to the size of his painting. By 1976, he moved to Massachusetts, which is where he would die. He had a long-term relationship with Boston Museum of Fine Arts School, where he taught. And here you see an example of that same work in one of the many exhibitions that displayed his work. But the interesting thing is, just as he never felt quite that he fit, Jewish, Catholic, where he fit in, there's no question that he pushed himself to be very much an American and an American artist. Again, when he came here in 39, do the math, he was 24. And he found acceptance. One has a sense from him that he never felt that he was accepted and recognized in the way that Rothko or Newman or Pollock or de Kooning was. And yet it's hard to say that he wasn't accepted with over 60 exhibitions and all the teaching that he did. Again, very differently is the work of Rudi Lesser, born in 1902, who also came from, of course, from Germany. And in 1933, as a young man, I should say, he was as a creator of etchings and lithographs. His work was already admired by the likes of Kate Kollwitz and Georg Gross. They said, this guy is someone to watch. But by this is 1926, this image here, 1925, 26 ring fight. And it's a rather unusual kind of work, is it not? With these two fighters that look almost ghoulish with their ears and their faces, and they're gargantuan, and the weird, almost togaed fellow behind them, as if this is a cross between a boxing match, a wrestling match, and something happening in the Roman arena. A very unique kind of vision. But by 1933, his studio had been stormed by the Nazis, by the SS, presumably as a degenerate artist, not necessarily because he was Jewish. His friends warned him, don't go back, and he didn't. He left for Scandinavia. He was in Denmark, and there he ended up for a while, but by 1940, the Germans had come into Denmark as they had to France, and he fled to neutral Sweden, not an easy thing. So here's the odd and interesting thing about Rudi Lesser. He spends the balance of the war in Sweden. He comes, however, to the United States in 1946 after the war is over. His brother had gotten here earlier, so he had someone to receive him. His mother was here. And again, he's someone who did fairly well while he was here. He taught at Howard University, one of a number of Jewish professors who taught at historically Black universities across the country, but he didn't stay there for long. He seemed to want to come back from DC to New York and its art scene. He had a certain amount of gallery representation, the Lotte Jacobi Gallery, for example. So he had a certain amount of success, but he never felt comfortable here. And I go back to this image that he did in 1930 that already suggests that his mind thinks in unusual ways. This is called Pogrom in the Middle Ages. So in 1930, Hitler is not yet in power, but maybe the writing is already on the wall, and he chooses this very medievalist view of the Jew with the horned hat and this mess that's going on, and you could see it as translated from the medieval past toward what is the very quick future. So here's the thing about Rudi. He leaves the United States in 1957 after really never having felt happy or accepted here. And he was accepted, but he didn't feel happy. And he goes back to Berlin. And the next 30 years of his life, he lives a relatively obscure, but clearly happy life. His dog, his young women, his chess game, the cafe where he hung out. This is a self-portrait done in 1987. He's already dying. He'll die the next year. But can you even tell the age? It's almost ageless. It could be 37, it could be 87, it could be whatever the age. And so he found his way and yet didn't find his way here. Which leads me to one last artist and one last image. And fast forward. This is a work by Michael Yoffin, Misha Yoffin, when I met him in what was then Leningrad, then St. Petersburg. At the end of the 80s, where his English was as broken as my Russian was. So it was a fun conversation between my broken Russian and his broken English. When I next saw Michael, he was no longer Misha, but Michael, he had moved from St. Petersburg to San Francisco and continued to paint in this almost tongue-in-cheek, almost Soviet realist kind of style. His English was rapid fire, as fluent as you could imagine. And having been thrown out of art school there back in Leningrad while he was still in an exhibition sponsored by the art school, here he came, and this is a painting that I think sums up concisely his vision of immigration and art. This is the 4th of July, 4th, and it says Yulia in Cyrillic, of July. So 4th of July, 4th of July, and you can see it's a diptych. And here's the American side with the American flag. Here's the Russian side with the Russian flag. Here's the dasha with its roof in disrepair and its wood covering pieces here and there to keep out the rain. Here's that nice American roof. Here's the feckless sky. Here's the cloudy sky. So even though we're talking summer in both cases, it's July, green trees, there are subtle differences that distinguishes one from the other. He is trying to explore both his past and his present, where he was and where he is. And that, of course, is always a complex issue and a complex problem for any artist coming from anywhere to anywhere at any time. But in the sweep of the 20th century in America, and now, as Rachel points out, questions in the 21st century for America and the world, it's a question to think and think and think and think about and maybe do something about. Thank you. You're muted, Rachel.
Okay, that helps. Thank you. Thank you so much, Ori. And which leads me exactly to the next question. How exactly did the US immigration policy look in the first half of the 20th century? I'm now pleased to introduce Rebecca Erbelding, who is the author of Rescue Board, The Untold Story of America's Efforts to Save the Jews of Europe, published by Doubleday in 2018, which won the National Jewish Book Award for Excellence in Writing based on archival research. She holds a PhD in American history from George Mason University and has been a historian, curator, and archivist at the US Holocaust Memorial Museum since 2003. She served as the lead historian on the museum's special exhibition, Americans and the Holocaust. Welcome, Rebecca.
Thank you so much. Thank you for allowing me to participate. I love these interdisciplinary conversations because I learned so much from them. And so thanks, Ari, that was absolutely fascinating. So as Rachel said, I am a historian of American response to the Holocaust, which of course means that I talk a lot about immigration. And although I work at the Holocaust Museum, I'm participating here in my personal capacity, not representing the museum. So I'm going to give kind of a quick overview of how immigration actually worked, how American policies affected the ability of refugees who were attempting to flee Nazi Europe between 1933 and really 1941. The first thing is it's really important to point out a key difference between now and then. While the term refugee was used throughout the 1930s and 1940s to mean the same people that we mean today, potential immigrants seeking to flee religious, racial persecution and violence, the US law did not have separate provisions for migrants, for asylum seekers, or for refugees. Only immigrants and non-immigrants existed in US law, and all of them had to follow the same slow, deliberate, bureaucratic practices. The immigration law, or the Immigration Act of 1917, exempted people fleeing religious and racial persecution from the literacy test, which was otherwise mandatory. And so bureaucrats in the 1930s and 40s said, look, people have thought about the issue of refugees. This is clearly the only stipulation that Congress is going to make for these people. So it's important to consider what immigration actually looked like. So let me go ahead and share my screen here. So this piece in the New York Times is April 27th, 1924, and it describes the new Johnson-Reed Immigration Act, which was also called the National Origins Act. This is the Immigration Act that was in place between 1924 and 1965. So the entirety of the Nazi period is under this one law. This chart represented, was alongside an editorial piece by Senator David Reed, who was one of the co-authors of the bill. And he writes in the piece, quote, until now, we've proceeded upon the theory that America was the refuge of the oppressed of all nations. And of course, the until now indicates that this is about to change. The two maps that spread out just below this headline demonstrate how immigration is about to be restricted from now on. So the US already had immigration restrictions in place beginning in 1882 with the Chinese Exclusion Act. It also exempted people from arriving from a long list of people who were determined to be grossly unfit for entry, and that is a direct quote. It included people with epilepsy, with hereditary blindness or deafness, people with mental illness, people who we would today consider part of the LGBTQ+ community. And remember this part, anyone unable to take care of him or herself without becoming a public charge. The Johnson-Reed Act passed in 1924 with overwhelming bipartisan support. This was not a partisan issue. It was signed into law by President Calvin Coolidge. So the Johnson-Reed Act places the responsibility on granting admission to the United States with consular officers abroad rather than immigration personnel at the border. So this is really the moment where Ellis Island becomes a holding zone for people who don't pass the very cursory inspection that you get upon arrival. Everyone else is getting their visas. You're going through all your paperwork, you're presenting everything in the country where you're living, no longer at Ellis Island. There was a set number of visas, 2% of the quote national origins of American citizens as counted in the 1890 census, available to each country. And as you can see here, by tying the quota to the 1890 census, the immigration restrictionists who wrote that bill are really attempting to nullify the impact of the millions of Jewish and Catholic immigrants who had arrived at the turn of the 20th century. By 1929, so again, before the Nazi period, Congress passed an overall cap on immigration at about 153,000 people per year. The quotas for countries, as you can see here, in Northern and Western Europe were the highest. More visas were available to people born in those countries. And this law was very clearly based in the pseudoscience of eugenics, which posited that there are separate races and ethnicities that have immutable, inheritable characteristics, and that could be tied to someone's country of birth. So there are elaborate charts that eugenicists make up talking about how Serbs are the worst and Italians are here and the British are the best. And that was part of a racial category. There are only very few exceptions to this quota system, to this racist system. The law granted preference within the quota system, so you could hop to the front of the line for unmarried children of American citizens who are under age 21, the parents of American citizens, and agricultural workers, farmers, and their families. So this would get you to the front of the waiting list. And there were also people who qualified for a non-quota visa that were not numerically limited. They were not tied to your country necessarily. So you still needed a visa, you still needed to pass all the paperwork, but there wasn't a limit each year on how many visas that could be issued to people in these categories. So immigrants from the Western Hemisphere, so anybody in North or South America could enter without numerical restriction. Children who are under the age of 18, wives, husbands are not added until the mid-1930s, but you could be a wife of American citizen and get in without being subjected to the quota. And professors and teachers who had academic contracts in the United States. So if you could secure a job with a university or with an accredited school, you could enter the United States without having to go through the quota process. Same thing with religious leaders, people who had contracts, job contracts in the United States and their families. And as you can imagine, this is a huge thing that refugee scholars and refugee religious clergy really tried to take advantage of. Note here that although you may hear of the so-called Einstein visa, these non-quota exceptions are the closest you actually get to that sort of thing. Einstein did not come on an Einstein visa. Einstein came as a visitor to the United States and then entered as a professor later on. So you could not, there is no, that is not a category at the time. So no matter whether somebody was applying for a preference or a non-preference quota or a non-quota visa, all applicants have to submit very extensive paperwork. If you've ever been through the immigration process, some of this will look very familiar to you. And the point is mainly it is a lot of paperwork, and it is a lot of paperwork at a time where it is physical paperwork, going from office to office, getting the proper stamps, meeting with the proper bureaucrats. There are expiration dates for a lot of these. Some of these cost money. It is very difficult. If you are successful in obtaining all of these papers and you pass your interview and you pass your medical exam, you can be granted a visa to enter the United States. So throughout the 1920s, quotas were usually full or near capacity. But in October 1929, of course, the stock market crashes. There's an economic depression that leads to new concerns that immigrants might become a public charge. So in 1930, President Hoover instructs State Department officials to strictly enforce that particular clause back from the 1917 bill. And they do, and immigration really drops as a result. Oh, here we go. Sorry, I skipped this slide. So you can see here how the quota is close to full, but then by 1933, as the State Department is strictly enforcing the public charge clause, immigration falls to the lowest level in recorded American history. More people leave the United States in 1933 than enter. And in January 1933, Adolf Hitler is appointed Chancellor of Germany. Diplomats there, US diplomats there, quickly begin sending detailed reports about Jews being molested on the streets, about Jewish businesses being boycotted, about books being burned. You can see here the headline of the Miami Herald on March 29th, 1933, German Nazis give order to boycott Jews. If you know about this history, you know that that boycott is happening 3 days later. So American newspapers are reporting actually in advance that the Nazis are going to be doing certain things. Over the 1930s, immigration to the United States slowly increases. The State Department slowly starts to adjust their interpretation of this public charge clause and to let more people through. And the State Department also reports that most of the people applying from Central Europe are German, or are Jewish, are probably trying to flee this country. And these officials recognize that the public charge clause was a major factor in how few were actually able to make it, particularly since Nazi Germany was stripping the wealth of all Jews who were attempting to leave. But they determined early on, the State Department did that, and this is a quote, "There is no relaxation in favor of Jews in Germany that can be made consistently with the law. Any applicant who is not extraordinarily wealthy and whose assets were able to avoid Nazi seizure needed an American financial sponsor. And that sponsor needed to be able to produce their tax documents, bank statements, insurance statements, letters of recommendation. If a person didn't have close family in the United States, German Jews often wrote to complete strangers, people they found in phone books, who might share the last name saying, 'Can you help me?' In 1938, of course, the Anschluss and Kristallnacht brought new urgency to this question. Many German Jews who may have been hesitant to leave before changed their minds. And after the Anschluss, Roosevelt combined the German and Austrian quota, which brought the new German quota to 27,370 visas per year. So that is the limit, about 27,000 visas per year to anybody born in Germany or Austria who did not qualify under one of those non-quota slots. So if you're coming under the quota, there's only 27,000 visas available. But the demand skyrockets. In June 1939, more than 300,000 people born in Germany, the majority of them Jewish, are on the waiting list for those 27,000 visas. Between June 1938 and July 1940, the State Department issues almost every single visa that is legally available to them. They're off by 15 in that 2-year period. But there is no appetite in the United States to change our immigration laws or to adjust the quotas to allow more people in. These two sets of polls were taken right after Kristallnacht. And you can see that 94% of Americans polled said they disapprove of what the Nazis are doing. And 72% also say we should not allow more Jewish exiles to come to the United States to live. So this gap between disapproving of what the Nazis are doing and being willing to be part of the solution at that point, which was immigration, there's a massive gap between those two things. With the outbreak of war in September 1939, State Department officials added additional steps to the visa application process. including proof that the applicant had their government's permission to leave. Often that permission would only be granted after a potential immigrant paid exorbitant taxes, particularly if they were Jewish. Again, this catches you in the loop. Your government, the Nazis, are stealing your wealth, which makes it really hard for you to prove that you are not going to be a public charge in your new country. By 1939, a Jewish immigrant from Germany could only carry 10 Reichsmarks, or the equivalent of $4 US, to the United States. The US also grew very concerned that Germany was taking advantage of this refugee crisis to send spies abroad. Many Americans feared that as Germany expanded, that those countries in Western Europe had fallen so quickly, particularly France, because of a fifth column, spies and saboteurs inside France, bringing the country down as soon as the Nazis crossed the border. The State Department, the FBI submitted to the State Department, you can see here, a 75-page list of the names of people whose citizenship had been revoked by Nazi Germany out of concern that German agents might use those identities to try to get to the United States. And you can see that a number of these people have been given the middle names Israel and Sarah, which indicates to us that the FBI is passing along names of people who had been deemed stateless by the Nazis and who were Jewish. The State Department cautioned consular officials to take particular care in screening applicants. By the summer of 1941, when this list was sent, the State Department also begins enforcing a relatives rule, which denied visas to anyone with close family still in Nazi territory. Travel too became a problem. The majority of European immigrants arrived in the United States by ship still, and due to submarine warfare in the Atlantic, due to the fact that passenger ships were being refitted by nations at war into troop ships, many passenger lines stopped sailing to the United States. By summer 1940, Lisbon became the port of exit, the only place where you could still get a ship semi-regularly to the United States. And for a lot of people in Central Europe, the idea of going through multiple countries with their own entry and exit visas was something that became impossible. On July 1st, 1941, the same day that new relatives rule was enforced and went into effect, the State Department also centralized all visa control in the United States in Washington. So all applicants for immigration visas still had to present all of their paperwork in their country where they were living, but there would also be an interdepartmental visa review committee in the United States that would also review your application. At the exact same time, Germany demanded the closure of American consulates in Nazi territory. So if you were in Berlin, in Rotterdam, in Paris at this point, in Vienna, you did not have American diplomatic personnel on the ground anymore to grant you a visa. So people started to look for other areas to go, or other areas in the neutral countries in Switzerland, Sweden, Spain, Portugal, Turkey, where there are still people who could grant them a visa. After December 1941, their hopes are dashed. In October, Germany had already declared Jewish immigration illegal, and at Pearl Harbor, the United States enters the war, and that introduces many, many more difficulties. And the nenext day, of course, December 8th, 1941, almost 80 years ago, about a week and a half ago, Helmno, the first stationary killing center built to murder Jews, opened in Nazi-occupied Poland. So although the Holocaust really did begin a long reckoning related to refugees and displaced persons, laws to aid them over the next 35 years still remained numerically limited. They remained limited to specific populations, with decisions tied up in the Cold War. So hand-wringing over America's failure to open immigration to Jewish refugees in the 1930s has still not resulted in a unified, bipartisan, long-term US government commitment to aid refugees. The 1980 Refugee Resettlement Act, which is still in force in 2021, ultimately places the number of refugees admitted to the United States in the hands of the president. and subjected to his political priorities. So for those fleeing racial or religiously motivated violence or even ongoing genocide today, the United States can look much like it did in the 1930s, with a door open just enough to garner hope, but slammed often enough for despair. So I will stop sharing my screen now, and I look forward to our conversation as we move on. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. This is not very encouraging what you're telling. And now we actually have someone in the panel who went through that process herself. Born in Ukraine and raised in Australia, Katya Grokhovsky is a New York-based artist, curator, and founding director of the Immigrant Artist Biennial. Her work has been exhibited nationally and internationally. Grokhovsky has received support through numerous residencies, including the Elizabeth Foundation for the Arts Studio Program, School of Visual Arts, MFA, Art Practice, Artist in Residence, Kickstarter Creator in Residence, Pratt Fine Arts Department Artist in Residence, Art and Law Fellowship, MAD, the Museum of Arts and Design Studio Program, Brick Workspace Residency, Oxbow School of Art Residency, Vasaic Artist Residency, Atlantic Center for the Arts, Studios at Masmoka, NARS Residency, Santa Fe Art Institute Residency, Watermill Center, and more. She has been awarded the Brooklyn Arts Council Grants, NIFA Fiscal Sponsorship, Artsland 2017 Prize, Asylum Arts Grant, Australian Council for the Arts Grant, and Friedman Traveling Scholarship for Emerging Artists, among others. Welcome, Katya.
Thank you so much, Rachel. Thanks for inviting me to be part of this very important conversation. And thank you, Rebecca and Ari, for kind of leading this conversation to the artists who actually experienced the immigration process, and was also working with a lot of immigrant artists. So I'm going to go straight into sharing my screen. And all right. Okay, so a little bit, so I'm going to start with my practice, just go over quickly how I work, what I work with material-wise and thematically, and then I'll introduce also some of the artists from my Immigrant Artist Biennial project and how that came about as well, and what's happening with it right now. So I am very much a mixed media, multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary artist. I am an immigrant. I was born in Ukraine, raised in Australia, and then came to the US about 12 years ago to study at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. And I am on a Genius Einstein, I guess, visa now, which is the green card, which was the artist green card that I received actually during 2020, during pandemic, and have been on from international student to 3 artist visas to green card process. So I did it all myself as an artist. So art is literally kind of a vehicle for me to migrate, and that's how I came to the US. My other immigration, which was from Ukraine to Australia, was very much through my parents. I was 15 when we left. I was born in Soviet Union. So what you see here, a photo on the right, is a drawing over a photograph from Soviet Ukraine. And that's me at a very messy desk, which I still work like that. And this is my current project that I'm working on right now, dealing with sort of this displacement and loneliness, and this alienation from family, which as it happened, I haven't been able to travel when I was working on my green card, waiting, and then pandemic happened. So it's going to be probably 3 years by the time I actually see my parents, who are living in Australia now. So my Australian immigration happened through invitation from relatives who migrated to Australia from Soviet Union in the 60s, and then we did the family chain migration. And then I came here on my own because I felt the American dream of an artist, and specifically New York artist, called out to me. And I work in, and this is my artist statement, I work in a variety of mediums, from installation, sculpture, painting, drawing, video, Let me go to the next one. Performance as well. I work a lot with archives, found objects, found materials, and I work with, often my work ends up in large scale installation. This is another example of just a few photographs I've been kind of working on digitally during pandemic, and now sort of am enjoying painting digitally over these archival photographs. I'm asking my parents in Australia to scan photographs from Ukraine. These are handmade that my parents actually produced in a tiny little dark room in our apartment in Ukraine, and a lot of people did that at the time. So I'm kind of enjoying going through what I haven't looked at for a long time. And this is me as a child in a variety of homes that we lived in. And the quote here is from Arshil Gorky, because I actually had, before deciding where to go for my master's after graduating from my BFA in Australia, I really wanted to leave Australia. I didn't feel I belonged there. My work always sort of called for me to travel. I almost moved to Europe, but I decided to come to America. I had this dream where Arshil Gorky, who I was really inspired by at the time and still love, called out to me in his dream and kind of said, move to America. I don't know what that was, but it was very vivid at the time. And I remember yelling to my mom that I made a decision. I got into School of the Art Institute of Chicago. I'm going. And it was very, very heavy, life-changing decision. So going back to kind of what I am doing, I did previously to this current project that I'm working with my photographs. This is a very recent installation, and this is kind of an example of how my work ends up in large scale installation when I do have access to spaces. This work particularly, and I put this poem by Emma Lazarus, who, of course, the famous poem, you know, had your give me your huddled masses, mass a yearning to breathe free. It's sort of a poem that I look to often because it's such kind of an illusion for immigrants, this better life, this dream, this American dream, which I also had. And I think living here for the past 12 years has kind of been unraveling this kind of dream for me and this kind of idea of America. I learned a lot. And now I'm in the crossroads of becoming, I'm going towards citizenship here. And I'm sort of dealing a lot with these themes in my work. So it's called Fantasyland. This particular installation was presented this year at Smack Mellon in Dumbo, a large scale exhibitions, sort of warehouse space. It's a lot of culmination of my previous work. I recycle my own work all the time. My work is often an immigrant itself. It has to migrate through varieties of spaces. It has to adapt. I realize it's kind of a stand-in for me. So a lot of these sculptures come from previous installation works. Previous sculptures have been reassembled, reinvented, recut, restaged. I activate my work with performances, and this is how I often have this. I look at performance as a kind of a bridge to the audience. And I work often with other artists and dancers. In this case, this was this is called Becoming American because I got my green card and I felt, okay, now who am I again? What does it mean to adapt and belong through my work? So I established personas. I work with personas. I make costumes, I make masks. So here's me in this costume and this big mask with yet another identity to be imprinted on. And also it's a nod to Disneyland, Fantasyland, Disneyland, the idea of this American shopping mall, idea of American dream as an illusion, and all these sort of notions come together in my work. And this is another example of a solo exhibition that I created in 2018, where I really went sort of crazy with color. And I attribute that to me growing up with very much in a Soviet Union kind of, you know, in gray buildings, kind of surrounded by black, white, and red, I would say, red banners everywhere. And really dreaming of, actually I was dreaming of America, and I was dreaming of these shopping malls and these things that we didn't have, these massive toys. So that's where these came from, where I went insane with beach balls and 8-foot teddy bears. And I often also play with community building, which is where my biennial project comes in and a lot of my curatorial work comes in. And it really does stem from me often having to really work hard at belonging. English is my second language. At one point, I didn't speak it. So I often remember that sort of nonverbal communication that I had to go through in Australia specifically. And I often look to other people, other artists that I work with in sort of these games that I create, and we kind of build these communities through my work. Of course, my work often also delves into darker parts of migration, which I saw my parents go through, is invisible migrant labor. And I come from a family of a librarian and an engineer, people with master degrees. We were very, well-read, intellectual family. My parents had to, of course, they didn't speak English, so they had to work in factories. They had to, my mom had to clean people's houses. And that kind of, I saw that, and I saw the sadness in that, but at the same time, I saw their determination to build something better for me, which they successfully managed to do, of course, and I attribute a lot to them. So I often work with my family because of that. I think my family has an interesting story. I'm Jewish. My grandmother, who's pictured here, is 96. She's a World War II veteran. She has lots of stories. She fought in the war. She was a nurse. She was, we had people killed in Ukraine, in massacres. So she has stories to tell, but she never did before before I decided to document these stories on video. And I decided to go back to Australia. For several years, I worked on this project, which was exhibited in 2019 at Brick in Brooklyn. And she, I would interview her. She would sit on this couch in her place. And then I decided that this couch was full of trauma and couldn't contain her trauma. So I created this kind of living room, which you kind of have to just watch the videos. You can't sit on the sofa, but the sofa is, again, you can see the teddy bears deconstructed, the couch deconstructed. So a lot of my work sort of turns things upside down in an absurd way. And my family is really becoming more and more part of my work as I'm more and more separated from them. And I think that's also a thread that I've seen immigrant artists work with a lot, and dive deep into their own histories. And a work that I really loved doing, and I hope to restage again, was called Immigrant Ball in 2018 at Flux Factory, where I invited about 7 or 8 immigrant artists from New York to do this performance with me for 3 hours. There was another installation before us. We decided, so the part of the ball was this high society ball that often immigrants serve, but they're not invited to. And there's this hierarchy, societal hierarchy, which I saw my parents experience. I experienced less, but still, especially in language and kind of sometimes cultural misunderstanding, see a lot of. And I also lived in London and saw a really huge divide between classes. And, as an Eastern European, I was always delegated to kind of back up the room. So I wanted to bring that high class society to this ball. But of course, we made ball gowns from this blankets and found objects, and just as we went through this ball. And then we had classical music playing and invited people to participate. And again, this is sort of really community building for me. And that's where the biennial came in for me, because the biennial was established in 2019. This is a logo that I worked with the designer to create. I did a flag as well. And this is actually part of our Kickstarter campaign, which we did to fundraise for the project. The biennial came as a culmination of my migration, personal migration, I would say, because I had access now to fiscal sponsorship. I had access to so much more as a green card holder than I had as an artist visa holder. So I saw the divide, and I saw an immediate need. I felt it for years, but I felt the need, there was a need for a platform for specifically artists who are not from here to be supported by this project. And I also worked with New York Foundation for the Arts for several years in their immigrant artist program, mentoring program. I was a mentee first and then a mentor. And so I approached NYFR to be our fiscal sponsor, and we're still with them. It's a DIY artist-run project, which presents work by US-based immigrant artists. And the first biennial, which is called Here Together, which is interesting because it was before, together, the word was mentioned so much during pandemic. But 2019, we were fundraising. all over the city in about 8 or 9 events through artist-run spaces, apartment galleries, commercial galleries, anything we could find. We did a lot of performances with artists. This is one of our fundraisers in Queens at Radiator Gallery. Artists donated works, we sold them, we staged performances with different artists. So everyone who participated was an immigrant artist from different countries, different cultures, different statuses as well, living in the US. So the idea is to specifically highlight it's national, but because we have a base here in New York and we have a fiscal sponsor in New York, we do have the central shows in New York. So we were also in residence at Kickstarter for 3 months, where this is an event that we did a Kickstarter with a dancer, Anna Kochina, Egyptian artist, performing, and a panel of leaders from residency programs, from NIFRA, from a variety of galleries, talking about immigrant artists in New York City. And I realized there was such a need for this. So we managed to launch in March 2020, of all time. And we launched at Brooklyn Museum. I think this was 9th of March, 2020. We collaborated, I curated this event. We collaborated with the museum for their first Saturday live event. And I curated 2 artists, Christopher Nunes and Hanae Otamura, Japanese artist and an artist from Costa Rica. So these are live performances. And then within a week, of course, the pandemic happened. So we actually had about 65 artists lined up. We also had an open call. We worked for a year or more, a year and a half before March 2020 to fundraise, to book venues, to get the artists. And then everything, crashed. But we managed to go online, to do a lot of Zoom events, panels, studio visits with a variety of artists that we already chose for exhibitions, waiting for the city to reopen. And then we went back to a live exhibition. This is a central group exhibition that was staged at Elizabeth Foundation for the Arts project space. And this included, so curated by me, this included 11 artists from different countries, including Mexico, Colombia, Iran, Bulgaria, Taiwan. Ana Mendieta is in this show. So Cuba, Georgia, Pakistan, Brazil, Africa. So very, very large kind of diversity. We really try to represent a variety of practices and works that deal with, this community displacement, alienation, and migration as well. And these are just some examples of this exhibition. This took place in October 2020. We had virtual events and a live exhibition that you could go see. So we're very excited that this actually happened. And unfortunately, the rest of all the exhibitions, we booked about 8 venues across the city. We had to go online. So a few more. This is Ana Mendieta work that was from 1973. I worked with her estate to present this. I really wanted a connection to a deceased artist who really, in my view, the biennial for me is, American culture post-war, it is all built by immigrant artists. That's how I always looked at the US, and that's why it was so attractive to me as well. And that's why I feel comfortable here still and establishing this project as well. And so just quickly go through the views of the exhibition. And this very multimedia. So this Cuban artist, also Mexican artist, Colombian, some more detailed work, details. So Cuban artist Yali Romagoza, who's an exhibition, also did guerrilla style performances at the time. So this is outside Whitney, without actual collaboration with Whitney, but she performs these performances outside museums, and every time she adds another female Latin American artists. So this talks about visibility and invisibility of Latin American artists, specifically women in museums and collections. And she has masks, she has costumes, and it's kind of a protest work. So this was part of the biennial. Another collaboration that we actually managed to stage live was with Greenwood Cemetery in Sunset Park, where I co-curated 2 performance events. And one of them was this artist from Peru, Ivan Sikic, where he actually focused on the part of the cemetery which has really sort of grown overgrown, sometimes unnamed graves, unlooked after, of immigrants. And he basically cleaned these graves for 4 hours that day. And just to finish up, we did have to go virtual, and we built a website and exhibited the rest of our artists, maybe 60 artists, or yeah, on this website with 3 virtual exhibitions plus performances, which had to happen on Zoom only. Plus we had panel discussions. So these are, you can see, these are older works. These are works that artists were supposed to show live, and some of them were supposed to be commissioned, but these were pictures that they had, so images that they sent to us. So Turkish artists, artists from Mexico, artists from Africa, artists from Mexico. So these are exhibitions that are called Homeland, Imminent Arrival, all dealing with migration in some way or another. And a large group exhibition that we were supposed to have as a closing event in, forget which venue in Brooklyn, but we did it online, and it was co-curated by the rest of my team with me as well. So these are paintings by 2 artists. And to finish up, this is the next Immigrant Artist Biennial will happen in 2023. And these are the 4 curators that were just announced. Some of them worked with me before, some are new, and we decided to postpone the project to 23 and not 22 because of pandemic, and just kind of reestablishing our venues, our fundraising, our funding. And, you know, it hasn't been easy to kind of get back on it, and the world has changed. So we're hoping that we get sponsorships and new partnerships and new venues, and we're slowly getting back into it, but we're going to take a year to establish the next iteration. So these curators, I'm very excited. They are currently already setting up a theme for the next biennial, and the theme is going to be different, maybe now that the world is different. At the time when I was establishing the biennial, I was thinking of course, election and politics and, you know, Trump and anti-immigrant sentiment. And now it's different. So where we are now is going to be up to them to decide. And I'm the director, but I'm not the curator in the next biennial, because I spent a lot of time curating the last one just to establish it. So you can ask me questions more about this, but we're currently pretty much in research for this project. So I'm going to.
Thank you so much, Katja. That was a very rich presentation. Before I'm asking a question, I have 2 attendees who raised their hands. So we listen to Debbie Kara first. Hello? No, she's not unmuted. Okay. Okay, so I guess I get to ask my question first.
I see there's 3 participants raised.
Yeah. Yeah, maybe it's easier to put
Easier to use the chat, I guess.
Use the chat. Yeah, I would appreciate that. So to all of you who raised your hands, please put your comments or question into the chat or into the Q&A. That would be much easier. Yeah, I mean, there's so many things. Where do we start? Rebecca, you mentioned that in since 1980 the immigration laws are quite different, and Katja mentioned the Einstein visa or the Genius visa. Would you like to explain that a little bit so we understand the difference between the situation for those who came in in the first half of the 20th century and for the others who for those who come now?
Okay. Well, the immigration question has ebbed and flowed and changed a lot since 1965. Theoretically, the Hart-Celler Act, which replaced the Johnson-Reed Act, is still in place, but there have been so many different addendums and changes that the immigration laws that we have now are basically a Frankenstein of the original law. As you, I'm sure know, every couple of years, somebody says, oh, we need a new bipartisan immigration act, and then there's all this debate and nothing ever happens. So I'm not actually sure when the Einstein visa was added into the immigration law. Since 1980, we've had a refugee law that is separate from immigration and separate from these kind of one-off acts that Congress would pass to address Hungarians in the 1950s and Indo-Chinese in the 1970s. And so 1980, they finally decided, you know what, refugee crises are ongoing and they are affecting people all over the world. And so let's have one law that kind of just covers us from now on. And the president determines the number of people who can come and where those numbers should be divvied up, how many people, how many refugees from Africa, how many refugees from these different populations. There are other ways to enter, of course. But to answer your very specific question, I'm not sure about when the Einstein visa was added or when they when they decided that we would just call it an Einstein visa, even though that's not historically accurate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely it was a big game changer, even though in the first half of the 20th century, MoMA managed, Alfred Barr managed to bring over a lot of artists and professors and academics were definitely brought over for to teach here in the country. So there was some kind of that.
That was the non-quota visa. So if you had an appointment somewhere, you could get a non-quota visa. There is a brief period of time in 1940 where you could get an emergency visitor's visa, and you could skip a little bit of the paperwork. And often though that was used for, Marc Chagall and Lifshitz and Piet Mondrian to be able to come, people who had fled southern France or fled to southern France and were in danger there. So they come under emergency visitors visas and then change their paperwork.
And they're already well-known artists at the time.
Right. That's the thing, is like it's pretty reserved for the top tier of people who were well-known in Europe, not generally artists who were younger or had not had commercial success in the United States.
Friedel Taubes, I did not mention, of course, came here on one of those farmer kind of visas. Even though he wasn't really a farmer, he managed to get in under the wire on that. So he wasn't even as an artist coming in.
Yeah, he comes with a group of students who end up German teenagers who train as farmers specifically so that they can qualify for one of those non-quota visas. Or I'm sorry, for preference under the quota. And then they end up at this farm in rural Virginia for a while.
Yeah.
But I do think that the immigration officers realized that he was not a real farmer, but since his immigration process was already so far advanced that they let him travel with the group and just use the quota. He did use the quota. One of the questions that I always ask myself is how far, how far goes the assimilation and integration. And I thought, of course, as you mentioned, Katja, much of post-war art is built by immigrants, and it very often seems very much by European immigrants. Ori, do you think there is, what are the determinants that make somebody a successful immigrant who can become part of the American society, and what makes them fail at that?
Let me give you two answers. One, statistically, it's remarkable, not just with respect to the arts, but across the board, how immigrants have consistently been contributors in huge ways out of proportion to their numbers to the fabric of America at its best. And that may be for the obvious reason. I'm really eager to embed myself into this new reality. And if I arrived, as Katya said, with a dream of how good it is, I really want to be part of that dream. And how do I become part of that dream? The second part of my answer is anecdotal. I taught a course many years ago. I had 30 students. It was an art history course. Okay. I had, out of those 30 students, 3 really outstanding students. One was from South America, one was from the former Soviet Union, one was from Israel. My American students paled in comparison with those 3, the other 27. And it was like, you know, I was born into it. It's no big deal for me. And I don't feel the obligation to try and do anything special. It's if I can make an analogy, I'm born into wealth, so I really don't have to make money. I'm born into less than wealth, and I'm an eager beaver about making money. Only this isn't about making money. It's about a much larger phenomenon of being part of something that you want to help, once you realize it's not as great as you thought, make greater than it was.
Yeah. Yeah, true. I also have the feeling that with the artists who you described and who are part of our larger identity, art and migration project, I feel it also has to do with the age and situation, of course, with the personality of the individual, but also with the situation, the place in their life in which they come. For example, you mentioned Annie Albers, and she, of course, comes with a whole teaching concept of this Gesamtkunstwerk of the Bauhaus, which Americans, or especially the Black Mountain College students and faculty, were eager to bring to the American students and to the American world. So she basically only had to teach what she had learned and taught in Germany. So she didn't really have to change her ways.
She was in a kind of bubble that made it possible, I agree. But I think that's more unusual.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, I'm thinking, forgive me, of your husband who came here in the late 90s as an artist, but he quickly, with not losing the vocabulary, stylistic vocabulary he already had in Germany, he found a way to make it relevant in a very specific sense to America, to New York, where you guys live. I mean, most obviously, alas, 9/11 provided a particular subject mechanism for him to charge forward with his work. And, you know, David Stern's work ends up in with the opening of the 9/11 exhibition in the Memorial Museum downtown. And but it's also because he, as an individual, it's him, is able to make that adjustment, to apply what he already is to a new set of circumstances and run with it. And someone else is not as capable of doing so, you know. The world from which Misha, Yoffin came and Katya came was a world in which artists lived in 2 worlds. If they were to work, they had to do what was prescribed by the state, and what they did that fed their souls, only a discrete group of people whom they could really trust would be aware of. You come to the United States, you can do whatever the hell you want, but there's no audience waiting to embrace what you're doing in any case. So can you make your vocabulary relevant to a new reality? And as you say, Annie Albers didn't have to go through that because of the peculiarity of her situation. But someone like Misha Yoffin did, and he tried to adapt, and it was very literalized, you know, with his diptych. But Raphael Sawyer's portrait of his parents in 1932, you're right. They're the older generation. It's very clear that they are not happy where they are. The artist's parents, they're self-isolated. They can't get the new language, literally and figuratively.
Yeah. And I think there's a big distinction that you have to make between a forced migration and a deliberate immigration, which which is a big difference. And Rebecca, you said refugees were not really, there were only immigrants and non-immigrants in the United States, I guess before 1980, right? And only after that, could you elaborate on that?
Sure. So for the entire period of the Holocaust, they use the word refugee to refer to German Jews fleeing Germany, to Jews fleeing Europe more generally once the war begins. But there's no kind of side door or separate set of procedures. There's only the immigration process.
Mm-hmm.
After the war, there are a number of individual acts for displaced persons, to bring displaced persons in outside of the quota system after a certain point, to bring Cubans in outside after a certain point, or to acknowledge refugee crises that are going on, people who are arriving on in US territory, and to find some sort of legal category for which they could be admitted. But it's really not until 1980 where that becomes a comprehensive thing, as opposed to kind of one-off laws or policies to address specific refugee populations.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So one big question, most of the artists that we looked at in our project were Jewish. All of them were Jewish, right? And it was because they were refugees of Nazi Germany. Do you, and Katya, you're Jewish too, do you think being Jewish makes a migration or immigration or the change of the place where you live easier or harder, or do you think it makes a difference at all?
Is this to me or to
whoever wants to?
So you're asking about the place where you end up?
I'm wondering whether it is easier if a change of place is easier for Jews who historically had to go through this progress so many times already.
Well, as personally, I think living in New York City, which is a very Jewish city, a lot of people think I was born here.
Mm-hmm.
So living in Brooklyn, getting very familiar with that, I feel very at home. So I think it is easier. It is easier than maybe other places in the US specifically. It's not as much as at the same time, I don't feel it as much, but I do work with, for example, Asylum Arts is a Jewish organization that I work with. And that project about my grandmother was sponsored by them. So I do approach, there are organizations here that work directly with Jewish artists today and sponsor them and fund them. And there's so much here. And that's partially why I keep being here, even though it's so expensive for an artist. It's very difficult. Hustle is my middle name. So, and I think especially being an immigrant, it's what I had to do for this visa and this green card as an artist was mountain. I lifted a mountain and spent my life savings. So it's not literally, I am as broke as every American artist I've ever known. So I entered the system now as a proper becoming American with debt and everything else, because the immigration process is extremely difficult. I think Rebecca mentioned bureaucracy, and like I went through all of that. I could teach a class on immigration and bureaucracy. And so, but at the same time, that Jewish sort of element, I experience that more when I see my family, when I explore through my work and my own identity as well. Because of course, coming from Soviet Union, I had no idea what Jewish was. My family kept me. Now I understand, knowing our story, I understand why my grandmother was so particular about not saying that I was Jewish in school and everything, because of Soviet Union was extremely anti-Semitic as well. So I was more aware of it there. My parents are very aware of it, but less so in Australia, less so, especially in New York. It's, you know, it's actually quite, you can flourish here with that. You can really find your people, and you can sort of find a ground that I think maybe other ethnicities, others don't have, maybe, especially in New York. But New York has everybody. So like in the biennial, we have everyone. Mm-hmm. And we do have Jewish artists from Africa, from, you know, anywhere living in the States. So I think that's been a project that really allowed me to also see so much variety of work being made. But we do connect on the sheer fact that we had to come here and migrate, and different statuses. And of course, what you mentioned, the forced migration versus we had refugee artists, we had political, you know, artists that had to run. I mean, all sorts of artists. So I find that very interesting, what the difference. I chose to come here, so I have a different, and do this thing, process and visa. And I just kind of didn't realize how bad and hard it was going to be. It took me 10 years, 10 years.
This to some extent goes back to what Ori was saying of his students, like they are, the thing about immigration is it's really hard. And so the people who manage to do it are people who keep at things and who are willing to go through this really difficult process. If you're lazy, you're not going to be able to come.
Right.
No.
And I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
No, it just, yeah, I think exactly that I experienced, like you have to maintain a level of visibility and exposure, and being on artist visas constantly every 3 years renewal, you had to say, well, what am I going to do for the next 3 years in the US? You have to prove yourself consistently. And I think that kept, actually in a roundabout way, that kept my career very visible.
Yeah.
And the lawyer that I worked with for 10 years has helped me establish my career, even though she's not in the art world, but she works with a lot of artists in New York City. It's in the, you know, because it kept pushing me. I had deadlines, or I'm out, or I couldn't, you know, I could lose my employment, or could lose all sorts of things. So I think immigration keeps you on your toes if you want it, if you decide. Many people leave it alone. It's too expensive, it's too difficult. They study here and they leave, or they study and do one artist visa, which is 3 years, and then leave. It's too much. I know many people who left, especially during pandemic.
And I think what you said about being able to find your place, especially in New York, but in America, I mean, one of the things that does make this place great is that you can, whatever you are. One of the things that is very sad of the Trump era, and I don't know where we are today, is that what has resurged is that anti-immigrant sensibility, which has been present in this country since the middle of the 19th century. You know, we've been having trouble with these foreigners ever since we got here. Is that what's saddest for America is that these people don't understand that you're trying to weaken us, you're making us worse again, not great again, by eliminating all this fresh blood, all this interesting input that can come. And as Rachel, for your question, it's also intersects another discipline and another project that we worked on, is trauma transmitted through the DNA. So the fact that Jews have been migratory throughout the last, give or take, 2 millennia, not that long, too long a period of time, does that mean that I, as a present Jew in the here and now, am more capable of being a migrant, a refugee, an immigrant, an emigrant than a non-Jew because of the Jewish tradition, even though I myself grew up here in Berlin? I've been here for 28 years. I've never left. Is it in my blood, or is it in there? So when I have to do it, somehow it comes to the surface. I didn't even know it was there. You know, hard to say. So that's the Alice La Kahana project.
Yeah, very hard to say. And actually, Deborah says also, although, as was commented, many immigrants successfully integrated, yet can we really ever know what their interior life was and if they ever got over their trauma? No. My own parents were very successful Holocaust refugee integrators, and yet in their interior lives and thoughts, they remained mournful for all they lost and the trauma of the war.
Well, and even among our artists, Rudi Lesser really was quite successful and probably would have been further, but whatever the trauma was, you know, he never felt comfortable until he went back to where he had started, and not to the blooming career that that Kollwitz and Grosz had predicted for him, but he had a comfort zone. Whereas Annie Albers, on the other hand, I would think she never felt discomfort. Well, she did. She expressed having distress at having that Joseph had to leave his career there because she was with him, because he was Catholic, she was Jewish. So had they not been married, he would not have had to leave, which is interesting. She didn't think of it in terms of herself, but in terms of him.
He might have been interested to leave anyways.
I would think so. The Bauhaus had closed down. Yes,
the Bauhaus was closed anyways. So.
Yeah. But he was probably nervous about coming here because he spoke no English. She was actually better equipped than he initially.
Right.
Also makes me think of Gorky, Arshil Gorky.
Yes, yes.
The trauma there never left, and he committed with it. I mean, beautiful, you know, paintings, some of my favorite of all time, but because I sense the nostalgia and the Armenia right there. It is the saddest, you know. So to me, that kind of, I remember that dream, and my mom actually remembers. Do you remember making that decision to move to America because you had a dream? I thought, yes, that's how artists, you know, make decisions sometimes. But the trauma was extraordinary, and it never left, regardless of his success or respect by his peers. And you know, he's in art history forever. So to me, that's inspiring, both sad and, you know, it's what makes an immigrant artist sometimes is that trauma at the core of their practice. I see it all the time.
Yeah.
So
we can see that you, of course, you never shed your past and your roots, and we can see that even with the artists, with two of the artists that you mentioned, Ori, with Friedel Taubes, who went to Germany in later on in the 80s and had a very strong reaction to that visit, which was 10 months long, and he almost stayed. And the same was true for Ava Hessa, who had the opportunity to work in Germany, which pushed her tremendously artistically, and really was a big breakthrough for her artistically, but for her psyche, she said it was my personal Holocaust. So so yes, human beings are very complex, and it does the immigration or migration, whether forced or voluntarily, just changes your identity, but you don't turn into a different human being. That's really not the case. So.
Yeah, I find Friedel particularly interesting because he lost complete contact with his family, but then after the war, when things were not good economically in Germany, he got letters. And I suspect he felt a lot of guilt. And his mother was apparently quite displeased with the younger son who had kind of left the family behind. So I wonder how that then filtered into his Holocaust sensibilities. And then when he came to Germany much later, how that in turn was within him and helped produce whatever feelings he was having. And as I mentioned in Patricia Louis' beautiful essay, she notes how at the end of his life, he was obsessively paging through this extensive Holocaust book. Mm-hmm. Not something one would have expected from someone who seems pretty much to have thunk of himself as more Catholic than Jewish. The last of his wives was apparently required to convert to Catholicism from Protestantism. His first wife didn't even know he was Jewish, and she was Jewish as he was. you know, he claimed to have been baptized, although there's no record of a baptismal certificate. So his, you know, identity was certainly twisted, turned upside down and inside out. But the Holocaust/Germany issue clearly got in there somewhere, and then it resurfaced, it seems to me.
Yeah.
To the point of we don't know what's going on inside, you know?
Right, exactly. I'm afraid our time is more than up. Thank you so much, Rebecca Erbelding, Ori Soltes, and Katya Grokhovsky for sharing your research, thoughts, and immigration experience and how that affects identity. This conversation certainly raised our awareness for of the plight of refugees and migrants, and encourages us to think about broader issues of relocation, transformation, and the psychological and cultural self as a centerpiece of human being. I wish you happy holidays, all best wishes, and see you soon. Goodbye.
You all.
Thank
Bye.
you so much. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.